Next, we're going to hear briefly on where we have been. Stan Swim, longtime parent at the school, friend, his family, the Swim family was instrumental in this facility that you see here, in helping us to have the capacity to grow for the future. Stan and I met at BYU. We were roommates there. His father, Gaylord, was a bishop of the ward in which I was assigned there. Stan's mother, Laurie Swim, here, was the chairman of the Board of Trustees from 2005 to 2011 and is currently on the board. Stan is the current president of the GFC Foundation and also very involved in the Sutherland Institute, which is a public policy organization that focuses on Utah state policy, but is also very active in the state policy network across the country, promoting principles of freedom and self-government and family and others. So without further ado, please welcome Stan Swim, sharing some thoughts on our history at American Heritage School.
Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you for a few minutes. This presentation adjusts a little bit each year, but I find I'm feeling a little bit differently about it even than normal this year for a couple of reasons. Usually, in the past, we have done this foundations training right after school concludes, and the halls of this building are about to become what I affectionately call a cave, or maybe not so affectionately, as all the children are about their summer's activities and doing those things. I'm enjoying this time because it's only going to be a few days before those children are back. We love to have them here. This building doesn't meet its purpose without them in the halls. And so, whereas in June, this presentation or this whole week, the learning that you're doing here might be against the backdrop of a school year's worth of fatigue and late nights and assignments, stress to get in, all that sort of thing. I hope that today there is a freshness to your eyes and ears and your hearts as you listen to what the many people you'll hear from will be presenting. It's my opportunity to spend a few minutes talking about the history of this school. I will have failed if by the time we're done you are not thinking about your place in the next chapter of that history. Past is prologue. And so I invite you as we're getting started here to think, to ponder, and yes, even to pray about why you really are here, what your motivations are, what you hope for your children, either those who are literally your children, your family, or those whom you will teach. And ask yourself what it is that you need to do next. I'm going to begin with just a couple of verses from two books of the Book of Mormon. You'll recognize the first one. I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents, therefore I was taught somewhat in all the learning of my father, and having seen many afflictions in the course of my days, nevertheless having been highly favored of the Lord in all my days, yea, having had a great knowledge of the goodness and mysteries of God, therefore I make a record of my proceedings in my days, yea, and I make a record in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. Now, we could take some time to unpack that, but there is a lot about education contained in those verses. How much did you catch? Being taught, first of all, language. It's very difficult to have thoughts very far beyond language which you are capable of expressing. We know that the Spirit can do that and give us those things that our hearts become so full we cannot express it. But if that's true, then it's also true that delving deep into language, demanding of ourselves the learning of language, is increasing our ability to feel and to act on spiritual promptings. We talk a lot, and you'll hear more shortly, about 4Ring and what that is. It's an incredibly powerful method. I would suggest to you that it's at work even in these couple of verses. Nephi talks about having learned, which I will assume contemplates research and reasoning, and then he talks about making a record, doesn't he? It's interesting what he would have been taught. The learning of the language of his father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. Now, the Egyptian culture and learning was almost totally alien to aspects of Jewish language and culture. The forms of worship were diametrically opposed. The emphases of those two cultures were also completely different. One culture built monuments to itself. One culture's only real building of consequence was a temple. So think about the difference in those things, and yet in the education of a prophet, it was important to have both, was it not? Next set of verses. And now we speak here of King Benjamin. I'm reading Mosiah chapter 1, starting in verse 2. And it came to pass that Benjamin had 3 sons, and he called their names Mosiah, and Helaram, and Helaman. And he caused that they should be taught in all the language of his fathers, that thereby, let me just parenthetically say here for a minute, isn't mathematics a language? Aren't many of our scholarly disciplines actually languages? You think about it. Art as a language, song, music, all of those are languages. Taught in all the language of his fathers, that thereby they might become men of understanding. That, I would submit, is a profound phrase. It means they do not just get to be keepers of facts. It means they don't just memorize in order to regurgitate. Become men of understanding, that they might know concerning the prophecies which had been spoken by the mouths of their fathers, which were delivered them by the hand of the Lord. And he also taught them concerning the records, the history, which were engraven on the plates of brass, saying, My sons, I would that ye should remember that were it not for these plates, which contain these records and these commandments, we must have suffered in ignorance, even at this present time, not knowing the mysteries of God. Okay, we've just been given 2 opposites against which to measure our work in education. Becoming men and women of understanding versus suffering in ignorance. Now, you could add to these verses at least another 24 passages in the Book of Mormon alone that are remarkably specific in talking about the learning process, the education process, and here specifically about its purpose. So as I spend some time over these next few minutes recounting the story of American Heritage School, I would like you to think about a question that I'm sure preoccupied Lehi and Benjamin and eventually their sons. What would it mean and what would it be worth to provide that education for your children? And I am not talking here in just monetary value. I'm talking in all media of sacrifice. Time, talents, treasure, prayer, all of those things. What will be required of each of us as teachers in Zion to prepare men and women of understanding with the children who have been sent in this generation? Isn't that the real question? It is for us, right? So I hope if that thought begins to stir things for you and you get a prompting, ignore what I'm saying at the moment and write it down, because that prompting will matter more than anything I'm about to say. Okay? The story of American heritage really begins nearly 150 years ago, As the saints got here to the state of Utah, Brigham Young set about establishing schools. And here in Provo was established the Brigham Young Academy with its headmaster Carl G. Mazer, who was instructed by Brigham Young to make sure that nothing was undertaken in that school except it be done through the Spirit of the Lord. Not even to teach the times tables, he was told, without that overlay from the Holy Spirit. That academy went on for many years, as we all know, but in the late 1960s, BYU announced that it would be closing that school. And there were many faculty who had their children there. Don't know what happened to all of those children, but there was a small group among those faculty members, led by Verlin Anderson and his wife Shirley, who wanted their children still to have the opportunity to learn in that kind of a context. And they embarked on what would become a multi-decade journey of sacrifice to bring that about. As BYU Academy closed, Verlin and those who worked with him set about trying to find a place where this could even happen. And eventually, by working with Elder Ezra Taft Benson at the time, they were able to secure the purchase of a building that the church was no longer using. And that was referred to earlier today. It's now the John Hancock Charter School, but a little building down here just north of the Purple Turtle. And for a couple of decades, that was American Heritage School. As you walked into that building, you ran into green benches that you see in the hall here. You had classrooms that weren't heated or cooled especially well. You had a building that wasn't necessarily purpose-built to be a school. You had faculty and families who laid it all on the line to make that happen. The sacrifice was truly extraordinary. Faculty who taught knowing that their payroll would be the last thing that would be met. And they did it anyway. Parents who somehow had to scrape together enough time commuting. Some of you may remember what Orem and PG looked like back then. There was not very much between 20th North and Orem and the Purple Turtle. I remember biking down that hill as a young man. The county was more spread out, and yet that school was not convenient for the Andersons. They lived in Orem. They lived in South Orem, a couple of blocks from Provo. Convenience just had nothing to do with it. Conviction did. Textbooks for a school like that couldn't be purchased new. Nobody could afford them. So they were secured from a landfill in Arizona. Against that backdrop of struggle and sacrifice, the school began to grow and try to accomplish what Verlin and his family had set out to achieve. One of the early things that was put together was something we now call the Patriotic Program. And Genevieve Cornell wrote that original script, and that program served as a synthesis of so much of what was taught here. It is not in a nationalistic sense that we offer that program year after year. It is in a sacrificial sense, meaning we look at the history of this country as the story of the Lord's dealings trying to preserve freedom for his children. But it was during one performance of that program that a widow was present, a woman named Mrs. Green. And she approached the leadership of the school after that performance and asked if there was anything that she could do to help. And almost in jest, the response was, well, you could pay our mortgage. Within a matter of days, that's what she did. Now, I'm not exactly sure why we ended up in a school that's all about American heritage in the red, white, and blue with green furniture. But when I walk around today, that green reminds me of her. To my knowledge, she never had children here, nor grandchildren. Am I correct in that assumption so far as we know? Never. And yet, since that sacrifice, this school has been blessed by the freedom of having no debt. So that was one sacrifice by someone for whom it can truly be said there was no other benefit. But as I mentioned, for each of these families, people who came here, there were sacrifices of all different shapes and sizes that many of us will never know. And yet still today, there is often the choice between tuition and groceries for families who walk through these doors. Sacrifice of that magnitude demands consecration and response. At the same time, Berlin Anderson was embarking on this incredibly visionary and far-sighted project. He had a student in one of his classes, my father, who had just come from California in the middle of the Vietnam War when things were crazy. Come from California looking for a place where basic Christian values, basic decency and character were upheld, not ridiculed. They were taught, not scorned. And that led him to BYU. And ultimately, he joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the two professors who shaped his thinking and his entire adult life were Berlin Anderson and one other, a Book of Mormon professor named Reed Bankhead, who would become his father-in-law. Those two men, by their example, by their personal sacrifice, and by the precepts they taught, laid foundation day in and day out for hundreds and thousands of students, of which my father just happened to be one. There wouldn't be a connection between Gaylord Swim and American Heritage for another 25 years, almost. But in the 1990s, after our family had actually moved into the same ward where the Andersons lived, I grew up in primary and the early stages of youth activities with Mrs. Acuna and her sister Janet, whom you'll hear from a little bit later. But my parents made the decision to enroll a couple of my sisters here. I was already a little too old and perhaps beyond hope anyway. But as they got involved, Dad was invited to serve as part of the Board of Trustees. And this school lit something in him much the way it had for Mrs. Green. And over the course of the next decade, he worked on things that dealt with curricular changes and other things, worked to try and take that vision that the Andersons had launched at such incredible cost and institutionalizing that, turning that into a set of practices and institutions that could then continue to grow and scale. Sacrifice is very challenging, and total sacrifice has its limits as a scalable matter. And this is one of the reasons I invite you so urgently to consider what your role is in the next chapter of this institution. It does not matter which resources you've been given. What will matter is how you put them to use. In the course of that decade or so, a couple of teachers, including Mrs. Updike, went to meet with a group called the Foundation for American Christian Education, or FACE for short. You'll hear a lot about FACE. This is where that all comes from. During the 1960s, a group of women in California had set about trying to capture and catalog primary source documents, original sources related to the history and heritage of this country, with the idea that those needed to be preserved and presented to each new generation. Presented not in excerpts, not in out-of-context extracts, but in their whole totality, unvarnished and without apology, so that each new generation could actually know where they had to look for their freedom. Rosalie Slater, Verna Hall, these women worked tirelessly, developed a method for teaching this based on their study of how the Founding Fathers learned. Now, if I can put that in perspective for just a minute. James Madison was not a very old man when he put together the Virginia Plan as he prepared for the Constitutional Convention. Do you know what he did in the year preceding that convention? In the study over his front entry at Montpelier, he consumed nearly 400 books in 1 year. Books in English, French, Hebrew, and Greek, and I think possibly even some in German. Multiple languages. Think about that as a feat of scholarship. That's what that generation was capable of. And friends, the generation that we're raising may face a challenge of equal magnitude, which in the Lord's economy means they've been sent here equal to that challenge. Will we prepare them adequately? The founders of FACE looked at what could produce that kind of understanding, those men of understanding, and tried to distill that into a teaching method. And it is what we call the 4Ring: research, reason, relate, record. I won't dive into that. You're going to get a much better presentation on it than I could give here in just a little bit. But I would submit to you the purpose of that method is the exact same purpose as what we just read in the Book of Mormon. It is to produce men and women of understanding, men and women who understand who their Father is, what the nature of man is, the need for and the reality of the great atonement of Jesus Christ, the divine mission that has been assigned to each one of them. That's what 4Ring is all about. As all of that came together year after year, gradually the school has continued to build and to grow. The day that we broke ground on this campus was September 7th, 2001. Friday. Tuesday was 9/11. And I think the day we moved into this building, we had somewhere a little shy of 300 students. So from the fall of 2002 to today, 15 years, the school's enrollment has a little better than tripled. That's taken a lot of sacrifice and a lot of continued discussion and thought about when we even build a building like this, what do we mean? That little worn-out church on First East, the Canyon Road in Pleasant Grove, served its purpose for a very long time. Why didn't we just build something similar to that? Why do this? Why do something that looks like a college campus in some ways when you walk in the door? Wouldn't another little red church have been enough? Do you know what very nearly came to that? One of the original architectural concepts for this school was based on the design of a megachurch. But the building itself didn't teach heritage. And so the building that you have today, I would submit, is a 120,000 square foot textbook. I hope now you feel surrounded by reminders of Mrs. Green. When you look at the architecture, I hope you see symbols of truth, of honor, and covenant. You see virtues covering the entrances, each of the entrances to this building. Don't just walk under those. Take note, please. When you hear what goes on in the halls, when you see what goes on in the classrooms, you'll see timelines, you'll see learning devices. When you look at what the children are wearing, why bother with a uniform? Why do that? Doesn't that stifle the individuality of a child? Maybe, depending on what you call individuality. Maybe it makes room for the child to find their real individuality. Brothers and sisters, each of these things have been developed, and I would say will continue to be developed as we as an institution and we as a community of parents, teachers, students, and alumni learn how to better carry out the mission that's been laid before us. This task is essentially intergenerational. It can't be any other way. At the same time the Boston Tea Party was about to happen, maybe just a little bit before that, the colonists used to communicate through something called committees of correspondence. Today we might use Facebook for something like this. Or if you were really afraid of getting hauled up for treason, maybe you'd use Snapchat, because hey, the history doesn't last very long. Okay. But the colonists communicated back and forth as they were beginning to understand the need to assert themselves and establish their freedom. I say establish because they'd already come over to a place where they hoped they would just have it. But establishing something is a lot different than just getting it in the first instance. When Alma sought to establish the church, it took a whole extra round of teaching, a lot of hard questions, right? That's what Alma chapter 5 is all about. When it came time to establish the freedom that Pilgrims and Puritans had traveled here to enjoy, there was a new challenge. We faced the world's largest navy, the world's most powerful economy. And I have to say we were lucky to face a very particular king. Wouldn't the history of this country have been different had we faced someone like Louis XIV of France, who would have just bulldozed everything here? Amidst all of that, all of the insecurity, all of the worry that must have been going through their heads over how they were going to take care of their groceries, over whether trade was going to be destroyed completely, shut down the colonies, basically leave them orphaned to wither up and die as a little strip of population along a vast continent. Would you like to know some of what they were thinking? Listen to this unsigned, unattributed quote from one of those town meetings. Listen to the power of their language. Listen to the intergenerational perspective. The hearts of the children turn to the fathers and vice versa. Listen to their worldview. Here's what they had to say. Our pious forefathers died in the pleasing hope that we, their children, might live free. Let none, as they will answer it another day, disturb the ashes of those heroes by selling their birthright. There's a lot in that short little statement. Not bad for a Facebook post. They call on the memory of fathers, remembering. They point to the hopes and desires that those people had. I'm convinced that Verlin Anderson was motivated by the hope that his children would live free. And given the kind of man he was, he didn't just mean free to do whatever they want. He would have meant free to become what they ought. The pious forefathers died in the pleasing hope that their children might live free. Let none, as they will answer it another day. To whom? Isn't freedom just something that we get to use ourselves? Of course not. Each generation's use of its freedom determines the degree of freedom the generation that follows them will be able to enjoy without further sacrifice. And we answer for that, not necessarily to that generation. They won't necessarily be here. We answer to the Father of that generation who's above. Disturb the ashes of those heroes. It is the mark of the modern and the small mind to obsess over the weaknesses and the failings of those who have preceded us as an excuse for not confronting the greatness in those men and women and holding ourselves to a higher standard. And that is rampant today. This is an age desperate for excuses. We can come up with all sorts of technology, and yet too many of our children are raised in despair. That was not true in the same way of some of these other generations, because they would not have seen that technology, that stuff, as its value. Let me give you one quick example. Henry Knox, a guy who today would have been a dot-com pioneer. At the age of 10, had to care for his family. Started working at the age of 10. Never really got a real education, was pretty insecure about that, not unlike George Washington, whom he would serve as a lieutenant general. Knox's business was books, not just books of any sort, but the newest, the best, the cutting edge. He ran a bookshop in Boston that would have been the envy of any bookseller in London. And he's the kind of person to whom Burke would have referred in Parliament when he said, we have to understand that Americans read. They understand, they comprehend. Knox was one of those people, not just one of them, but the fueler of a whole generation of those people. If the British closed the port of Boston, there would be no import of books from London. It would mean the end of his business. And yet Knox is the person who tramped all the way to Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain with a bunch of troops, and in the snows of winter, hauled those things over the not very tall but very steep mountains between Ticonderoga and Boston to get 58 cannon into the possession of George Washington to drive the British out of the city. He was one of the first to sacrifice. That's the same kind of story that I think surrounds us here. I want to close by unpacking the word heritage for just a minute. It's an easy word to use. That's good. because it means a lot. I just want us to be conscious and deliberate in thinking about that meaning. Okay? And that last quote from the meeting of Roxbury, disturb the ashes of those heroes by selling their birthright. That birthright was a heritage. It was a heritage of religious and economic freedom. It was a heritage of family. It was a heritage of freedom from oppression. And it's now a great legacy of liberty that includes a Constitution, a Declaration of Independence, the two greatest documents that have ever been given through the ages for the preservation of individual freedom. When we say heritage, we don't take it lightly. But the word heritage has an opposite. What is it? Well, if heritage literally means the gift that you and we and I are given freely from those who have preceded us, then the opposite of that's really simple. It's a mortgage. It's the debt that someone leaves behind that their successors will have to pay. And the difference between those two things is the point of consumption, or the minute that our children walk through this door. When they do that, will we be dropping them off here assuming that the faculty's just going to take care of it? Faculty, will you just be doing that with the assumption that it's just a day job? Or can we all understand that as each child walks through this door, that there is a family's worth of sacrifice coming with them? That sacrifice will probably come in lots of different forms, but let me just suggest a couple. Spending more time with your kids in homework than maybe you might be used to, so that you can drink of the same thing they're drinking. Praying, studying scriptures, doing those things. Whatever your resources are, I invite you to explore and prayerfully make a sacrifice that seems fitted to you to make this year a powerful one for you and for your children. We know what the birthright is. And this is a birthright experience that we're all engaged in. As we start building new facilities, new campus, there will be more innovation, more adjustments, updates, changes. Changes will be coming. That's part of growth. It's also part of us learning to do our job better every day. But what must always guide it is this goal, that we raise men and women of understanding who understand their relationship with their Creator God and who are committed to doing His work while they're here in this world. My hope is that each of us will be successful as we prayerfully and relentlessly pursue that task. Thank you.